That was another 62 weeks later, or a total of 483 years. Now it says he will confirm the covenant with your people for 1 week. Some believe that the one who is confirming the covenant is the Antichrist. Go with me to Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. And he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the midst of the week, he will bring an end to the sacrifice and offering. Who is it that made a covenant? Where is there a covenant that is ever made with anybody but the Jews? The covenant under which we are saved is a covenant with the house of Israel. The new covenant that I will make after those days is with the house of Israel. When he says 70 weeks are determined upon thy people, what is the subject of the whole prophecy? Daniel's people. How much more time for them to complete their purpose as a people? Literal Israel at that time was to introduce and proclaim the Messiah, which they did at Pentecost. The 12 apostles were Jews who then proclaimed to the devout Jews gathered from every nation that Jesus was the Messiah. They took it then around the world. So for the first 3.5 years, Christ in person confirmed the covenant. Someone read for me Hebrews chapter 2, verse 3.
How shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which at the first began to be spoken by the Lord, and was confirmed to us by those who heard him?
The gospel, spoken first by the Lord, 3.5 years later, confirmed by those that heard him. Remember when Jesus ascended, he said, as the Father sent me, so send I you. First, I will do it, 3.5 years. In the midst of the week, 3.5 years after he was baptized, he caused the sacrifice to cease. He fulfilled, and not for himself, but for others. He died. He was cut off. Matter of fact, I want someone to read for me Isaiah 53, verse 8.
He was taken from prison and from judgment. And who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people was he stricken.
All right, so there's no question the one who is cut off in the midst of the week is who? It's the Messiah. You know, it is so sad and it is so heartbreaking that a number of dear Christians out there believe that the one who confirms the covenant is the Antichrist. They take that verse that you find in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3 and 4. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day will not come except there come a falling away first. The man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he as God sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. And they think that in order for the Antichrist to sit in the temple of God, the earthly temple must be rebuilt. But the temple over which the Antichrist sits is the one we've been talking about on earth, God's people. He sets himself up over God's people and says, I am the supreme authority. I am the vicar for Christ in the world. That's putting yourself in the place of God over the temple of God. And so that was the fulfillment. But there's this whole, it's basically a Jesuit interpretation of prophecy that was developed by Francisco Ribera that says it's the Antichrist that is going to confirm the covenant. Where does the Antichrist ever make a covenant to confirm with anybody? And to call the Messiah the Antichrist and get those two confused, can you mix up anything more dangerous than that? To call Satan Jesus and Jesus Satan? You know, part of the problem is, let me go back with me to Daniel chapter 9. It says here in verse 26, after 62 weeks, Messiah is cut off. Well, it is after the 62 weeks he's cut off. But not for himself. He's cut off for us. And then sort of as a footnote, Daniel is told by the angel, the people of the prince who are to come, the Roman power, will destroy the city and the sanctuary, meaning the earthly sanctuary would be destroyed. And the end of it will be with a flood. Let's not talk about a water flood. They often talked about an army that would overwhelm them as a flood. Till the end, the wars and desolations are determined. The earthly sanctuary was destroyed in 70 A.D. But the subject of this is the Messiah. Then he's going back and he's saying he will confirm. It's going back. That was just a footnote. It should have been in parentheses. He, the Messiah, will confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. In the middle of the week, he'll bring it to an end the sacrifice and the offering. All right, so That takes us to 3.5 years, AD 31, Jesus dies. And we've got some charts here that you can look at that outline the 490-year prophecy. Christ is baptized in 27 AD. One of the well-established dates you find in Luke chapter 3, verse 1. 31 AD, Jesus dies in the midst of the week. He confirms it in person for 3.5 years. Then for 3.5 years, as we read in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 3, it's confirmed through those that heard him. What happens at the end of that period? Acts chapter 7, Stephen is stoned in AD 34. He dies just like Jesus died. Taken out of the city, prays for the forgiveness of those who are killing him. He preaches before the Sanhedrin just before he's condemned. He's like a model of Christ. They take away his clothes, and they lay the clothes down at the feet of someone named Saul, whose name is later changed to Paul, who now becomes the apostle to the Gentiles. Isn't it interesting that in 34, and by the way, the Jewish Supreme Court, they plug their ears. They take Stephen out. They don't want to hear the gospel. That marks a very somber point for the nation. They had completed their 70 weeks, were cut off for them, their time allotted to introduce the Messiah. Then the gospel not only went to the Jews, but it went to the Gentiles. You keep reading in Acts chapter 10, Peter now goes to Cornelius' house. You remember what a struggle that was for him? Because they were only going to Jews up to that point. Jesus had said, don't go to the way of the Gentiles. Go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So finally they broke out of the shell of just Jews, and they began to take the gospel to the Gentiles, who then became grafted into the stock of Israel. And so that was 34 AD. But wait, back to 1844. Going back to 457, if you go from 457 and you count the 2,300 evenings and mornings, some will say, it's 2,300 days. That's 2,300 years. By the way, for those who insist that it's evenings and mornings, listen carefully. Some people say you can't call it a day for a year here because it's evenings and mornings. What is the subject of the sanctuary being cleansed? Isn't that the Day of Atonement? How often did the Day of Atonement come? Once a year. So, if the subject is the cleansing of the sanctuary, and it's saying 2,300 cleansings of the sanctuaries, if it happens once a year, what does that add up to? It's 2,300 years. Either way, you can't escape it. It's 2,300 days of atonement, or it's 2,300 years. It comes to 1844. And what would happen? The sanctuary would be cleansed. What happened in 1844? In heaven, Christ entered into the last phase of his high priestly ministry, the cleansing of the sanctuary. Now, do buildings get saved, or do people get saved? Did Jesus die to redeem and cleanse buildings or people? What's happening there is mirrored in what's happening here. What happened in 1844 on earth? There's this great religious awakening. Matter of fact, I was reading here about Joseph Wolff. And not only were the Millerites called Adventists, Adventists weren't all Seventh-Day Adventists. Seventh-Day Adventists weren't formed until 1863. Adventists were from all different churches. They believed in the second coming of Jesus in 1844. There's one incredible Jewish convert named Joseph Wolff, who was a minister. Between 1821 and 1845, he went, listen to this. He went, according to his journals, to preach the speedy advent of the Lord, and they all thought Jesus was coming because they thought the earth was a sanctuary. Palestine, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia. They didn't take jets back then. Georgia, through the Ottoman Empire. This is one guy. Greece, Albania, Turkestan, Hindustan, Holland, Scotland, Ireland, Constantinople, Jerusalem, St. Helena, and New York City. One guy. Just talk about the protection of the Lord to keep you alive. There's a Catholic priest in South America that studied and learned these things, and he began to preach the same thing around South America, that Jesus was coming in 1844. It was a global movement. But then he didn't come. Why? Because they misunderstood the prophecy. Oh, that proves that it's not true. Wait a bit. What about when Jesus died on the cross? Did the disciples misunderstand those prophecies about the first coming of the Messiah? Did that mean they weren't his disciples? No, it's not the first time God's people have misunderstood the event. It was a great disappointment. They said, we thought he was the one that would deliver Israel. They had the date right. They had the event wrong.